Hello everybody, this is Leah and welcome to my YouTube channel, Nerd Girl Power. Yeah, I woke up feeling okay today, I guess, but I felt maybe things were a little upside down, but on the bright side, I wasn't coughing up baby slug-like creatures into my sink, so at least there's that, right? In other words, today I am going to be talking about Netflix's Stranger Things. Season 1, to be more specific. We'll get to Season 2 in another episode. But a little backstory. The first season of Stranger Things aired on Netflix in the summer of 2016, and it broke the internet. I can't really say, anything else. The internet just like Stranger Things come on and the internet, poof. It was a sensation. People loved it. It was just non-stop Stranger Things for a little while there. Finally, I decided to check it out, and I'm not really a person that cares much about things that break the internet. That Bird Box, I really don't care about. A Quiet Place, maybe I'll watch it, but I am glad that I watched Stranger Things because I understood why that broke the internet. It's just that damn good. And I have watched both seasons a couple of times now, and it's just genius. There's nothing, I don't know what else to say about it. It's one of Netflix's strongest offerings, and with good reason. So, before we get into my discussion of Season 1, I actually do have some merchandise for this. This would be my Mike and 11 pop figures. And a little Demogorgon plushie. Isn't he cute? Mr. Clark, the science teacher, as a pop figure. Here we have Upside Down Will. And a Demogorgon pop figure. And believe it or not, guys, this is not all of my Stranger Things merchandise. There's more, but I'm going to save that for later episodes, so that I don't reveal too much at once. I like to kind of go slow. So, as a warning, from this point forward, I will be spoiling parts of Season 1 of Stranger Things. So if you have not watched it and you find your way onto this YouTube channel, that is something that you might want to keep in mind. There will be spoilers. Okay. To sum up the plot of Season 1, it centers around a group of 4 friends, all of them boys, and they're in middle school around the ages of 12 to 13 years old. And they're not the kids that are, the popular kids. They're nerdy. They play Dungeons and Dragons. They ride their bikes. They're in the audiovisual club. The science teacher, Mr. Clark, is their mentor. Oh, and this takes place in, I believe, in 1984. And it takes place in a town of Hawkins, Indiana, which looks like a small town, an ordinary small town, calm, quiet, and peaceful. And of course it's not, because this is a horror-themed story. So, of course, Hawkins is not calm and peaceful. But one night, the friends are playing Dungeons and Dragons, and they finish their game, and they split up. They all go home. One boy, Will, he's actually could be considered the smallest and maybe the most vulnerable of the group. He goes home, and he ends up disappearing. under mysterious circumstances. His mother finds him gone the next day. None of his friends have seen him, so Will has disappeared. And right after Will disappears, another kid about the same age makes an appearance in a diner in Hawkins. And she's a little girl, her head is shaved, and there's just something kind of unusual about her. And the three other kids, Mike, Dustin, and Lucas, figure out, come upon this girl, and they end up, her name is actually 11, because she has a little tattoo with the number 11. They end up connecting the appearance of 11 to the disappearance of Will. And they also figure out that 11 is no ordinary child because she possesses paranormal abilities, or PSI abilities, and the boys quickly figure out that they can use 11 as kind of a homing beacon to help locate Will. And they actually do locate Will. They find Will, but there's a price that's paid for finding Will. So that is the summary, plot summary in a nutshell of season 1. Okay, and like I said, I loved this show. I can't really think of anything bad or any complaints that I have about season 1, but there are lots of things I love about it. So let's talk about those for a moment. And one of the things that I love about season 1 is the fact that it's set back in the 1980s. And there are a couple of reasons why setting it back in 1980 something was a good move by the Duffer Brothers who produced the show. One of those reasons would be that its targeted audience are people in their 30s and 40s, like myself. And we grew up during the 1980s, so we can just watch a show and kind of point and go, oh yeah, that's how things were back then. We rode our bikes, we didn't have cell phones, no computer, and if we wanted to get a hold of one of our friends, we called them on the phone, or more often we just came knocking at the door, banging at the door and said, hey, you want to go hang out? Okay, let's go. And we'd be off. Our parents told us to be back by the time the street lights came on. That was our curfew. And we didn't check in. We did whatever we did, rode our bikes around, explored, just, did kid things. And I remember doing that on a Saturday. There was nothing better than just hopping on my bike and riding away and exploring my town, and then coming back when it was almost dark. Dinner was on the table, and we'd watch one of our 5 channels, I think, that we had on the television, go to bed, and repeat the whole process the next day. So there was that aspect, which was nice. And also the fact that it was set in the 1980s, it made things actually be scary. And I'm not just talking about people's hairdos, although some of those were pretty scary. Or the fact that the movie Poltergeist was big back then, which was a horror movie that Will convinced his mother Joyce to go see, and apparently terrified him like it did me. No, the fact that we didn't have cell phones or easy ways to communicate, and it was easier to be isolated during that time period because of the lack of communication devices, that makes it scary. One of my favorite stories is The Shining by Stephen King and the movie by Stanley Kubrick. And one of the reasons why that story is so terrifying is the isolation factor. The Torrance family is stuck up in the mountains and doesn't have any way to communicate with the outside world. So they get trapped in a hotel with a bunch of ghosts that want to do bad things to them. And that's what makes it terrifying, is the isolation. Because isolation is actually a real thing. Because believe it or not, there was a time when we couldn't easily communicate with the outside world. We were relying on landlines. If those went down, There was no internet, no cell phone, you know, no anything else. If we got lost, we didn't have a GPS to set us on the right track. So we'd have to rely on maps, and you could very easily get lost someplace. And if the conditions were right, who knows what could happen to you if the conditions were right. So that isolation thing with the 1980s, that actually served to make a very creepy backdrop to the story. Oh, and speaking of creepy, Stranger Things, and another reason why I enjoyed it so much was because it was scary. And you're probably thinking, well, this is something that was obviously inspired by Stephen King and John Carpenter, and more on all that in a minute. So, duh, of course it might be scary. Well, not everything is necessarily, you know, scary when it comes to horror movies made in the modern day. I mean, there's a lot of CGI in most modern horror movies. And don't get me wrong, Stranger Things does take advantage of the CGI because it's a main monster, the Demogorgon. You would have to use CGI to make that look realistic. The practical effects wouldn't work there, but there's not a whole lot of it. A lot of what makes Stranger Things creepy is what you don't see. One of my favorites is when Hopper is Hopper the sheriff, Jim Hopper, is investigating the shed in Joyce Byers' backyard, and you can see that something is watching him, and it's just really creepy. You get goose flesh on your arms. There's also that scene where the Demogorgon is actually in Joyce's house. Nobody knows it except Mike and Nancy's little sister Holly, and she can see it like it's literally about to come out of the wall, and you can see that thing just waiting on its prey, stalking. And you know that it could end up being very, very bad. Spoiler, it doesn't. But it could end up being very, very bad, and just a feeling of being watched. If that's done effectively on camera, which it is here, the camera angles and just with the music and everything, and the sound and everything else, that's just, for me, it's a very effective scare to think that someone or something unknown is watching you and is hunting you like an animal. So that is one thing that I just adore. Another thing, actually, that I adored about Stranger Things. I also thought that the performances, all of them, were just spot on. Even the minor characters like Mr. Clark, where not sure the name of the actor, but the actor who played him just was a convincing middle school science teacher. We had Winona Ryder as Joyce Byers, and she spends most of season 1 understandably out of her mind because her son Will has disappeared and she's trying to find him. And Winona Ryder's able to portray that, but you never feel like she's a basket case. You always feel the sympathy for her because she's a mother and her child is missing. There's also the sheriff, Jim Hopper, played by the actor David Harbour, and that is another one of my favorite performances. Hopper is somebody who's not had an easy life. He was married, they had a child, and we find out that his child died of cancer when she was 4 or 5 years old. And of course his marriage ends up busting up. And Hopper is, you can tell that he has a drinking problem. He's kind of promiscuous. He uses sex and alcohol to fill the void left by his missing child. And the disappearance of Will and the appearance of Eleven that ignites something in him, and he makes it his mission to try to find Will. And that's just, David Harbour just was phenomenal in this first season. Made a very sympathetic but really likable character, and you could understand where he was coming from. I also thought the children and child actors, they were phenomenal. I've got to give shout out to Millie Bobby Brown, the actress who played Eleven. And one thing to remember is that Eleven has very little dialogue, at least in the first season. She talks a little bit, but she's a child who's been a lab experiment and has not had a whole lot of human interaction, so she doesn't speak very much. And she's not been socialized, so she just has no clue what a girl her age is, supposed to be like. And most of what we get from Eleven is Millie Bobby Brown's face and her movements. And I don't know if I've ever seen a face that could convey just that much emotion. As you just look into her eyes and you know what's going through her mind, even if she's not talking. And I thought that was, for such a young actress, a young person, I thought that was spot on and very affecting. And the characters are another reason why I love this show. I mean, sure, it's scary and it's set back in the 1980s, so you have scary and you've got nostalgia. But the characters are just, they're so believable. I mean, you can relate to them. You have Joyce Byers, who's a single mother trying to make it on her own. She's got 2 sons, Jonathan and Will. And you can tell that they're kind of the outcast family in Hawkins. And they're quirky and they're unique. And it's just all something, relatable. Will's an artist, Jonathan's a photographer, and they're just trying to make it in a society that casts them away because Joyce is a single mother, and society, especially back in the 1980s, wasn't very kind, to that type of person. And like I said before, you've got Sheriff Jim Hopper, and I think out of all the characters, I think that he might be my favorite, because there's just so many layers to this character. It's mentioned that they moved out, he and his ex-wife moved out of Hawkins, or he moved out of Hawkins for a bit, so he's had experience working in a larger police department, and it shows, because out of all the police, when Will disappears, Hopper's the one that knows what he's doing, and he's able to actually somewhat professionally conduct an investigation, because I know none of the other cops are, so he's a really good police officer, and you can tell that he's really got that dad or nurturer vibe going on, partially because of his job. It's a job where you're supposed to protect people, and the fact that he was a father and lost a child, so the disappearance of Will is something that he takes personally. And once he figures out that Will is not dead, because there's actually a fake body of a dead boy thrown in the river in order for Hawkins' lab, which is responsible for the death or for the disappearance of Will and creating Eleven. They're trying to cover their tracks. Hopper figures out that this body is fake, and when we're talking about the creepy, this is a pretty disgusting, gruesome scene, actually, even though it ends up being fake. But yeah, that was just pretty gross. And he takes this personally, and he decides he's going to go find Will, and he and Joyce end up venturing into the Upside Down and pull Will out, and Hopper helps revive Will, who's probably like that close to being dead. So he has that nurturing. He's an alcoholic, you can tell that, because of the death of his daughter. And that's not something anybody ever really gets over, is the death of a child. And you can see that in Hopper. He's haunted. There's no other way I could describe it. The town of Hawkins, Indiana might be haunted, but Hopper is a haunted man, and he has his own demons and ghosts. And the way David Harbour is able to portray him on screen so that you still root for him and you're on his side, I loved it. All right, and let's get to the elephant in the room here. Stephen King. That's just one of the influences on Stranger Things that I wanted to talk a little bit about, because the show borrows from a lot. Not only does it borrow from Stephen King, it borrows from John Carpenter, Steven Spielberg, and just a whole mix of 80s classic nostalgia that we all grew up with. But I think Stephen King was a big influence on it. And the Duffer Brothers will tell you that, because they were originally wanted to make a movie out of it. They were turned down, so they went and they made Stranger Things, which actually is kind of similar to it, because you have the 4 kids at the beginning, and they're your losers club because they don't fit in anywhere else. They're bullied. In fact, seeking revenge on a bully is, one part of this story, because there's one that won't leave the kids alone, and his name is Troy, and he's laughing at what's supposed to be Will's funeral when people think that he's excuse me, supposed to be dead, and his kid's laughing at his dead classmate. And Eleven, using her paranormal abilities, makes him piss his pants. And that's just, to me, that's classic King, where the bully gets his just desserts. And you also have a child with paranormal abilities and a shady government operation. I mean, all that is very Stephen King. There's an operation in the King universe called the Shop that's buried in Black Ops. And it seems like it is kind of a cousin to Hawkins' Lab. And, of course, we all remember the movie Carrie and Firestarter, those stories where people have paranormal abilities. It's evident in a few other King books, but those stick out, and they were obviously inspirations. And you even have a character reading the Book of Cujo, and somebody makes a specific reference to Stephen King, like, oh, this is out of a Stephen King novel. So it's very tongue-in-cheek, without being too over the top, I don't think. And just, the other influences too, like Steven Spielberg, that monster, the Demogorgon, actually kind of seems like maybe something that would be in a Spielberg movie, if he did one back in the day about a town haunted by a monster. I mean, that Demogorgon's very Spielberg. The music and the sound, that is just all John Carpenter to me. So it's still an original story, and it's still its own thing, but just all these little influences I love. And it's just, it's like coming home after you've been gone for a little while and just seeing all the familiar things. Everything's where it's supposed to be, and you can just sit down on that couch or grab that blanket, and there's just some kind of comfort there. And that's how it is with Stranger Things, with all the King references and the Spielberg and Carpenter influences. Okay, a little bit more of why I love this show so much. And one reason is that as how it treats its female characters. One of them is Nancy Wheeler. Nancy is the older sister to Mike, who's friends with Will. And she gets pulled in because her friend Barb is attacked by the Demogorgon one night. And Nancy drags Barb to this party because she wants to hook up with Steve, who at first comes across as a typical 80s douche with that hair and, you know, the fact that he's popular and, you know, he's kind of a jerk, but he's kind of charming too. So Nancy falls for him. And she sneaks out to this party along with Barb. And Nancy kind of leaves Barb in the dust. And this is all, you know, typical teenagers. Somebody, you know, people are friends, and then somebody starts dating, and someone else gets left out, and Barb's at someone else. Nancy and Steve have sex for the first time. And of course, Steve is kind of boorish afterwards. But in your typical 80s movie, having sex, if you had sex, you wouldn't survive. Look at Friday the 13th. Look at Nightmare on Elm Street. People have sex and then gone, dead. The monster gets them. Well, the monster doesn't get Nancy. The monster gets Barb. The monster gets Barb because she's separated from the herd and she's alone and vulnerable. The monster doesn't get somebody for having sex. And I just love how this whole trope has stood on its head. And when Nancy is being questioned by the police and her mother's there, she admits to having sex, but then basically tells her mother that it's none of her business what she does with her body, and that they should be focusing on finding Barb, not on what Nancy does in her bed with Steve. And that whole scene was just wonderful, and it just screamed, you know, we may be based on horror from the 1980s, but we're going to be different in how we treat women, and here it is, here it is. And that is just one of my favorite parts to this show, or at least in the first season. And I also loved how season 1 concluded. To recap, Elle is able to open up, or 11, or Elle, is able to open up a portal to the Upside Down. And at this point, she's become friends with Mike and his friends, and she and Mike are attracted to each other romantically, and they almost kiss. Mike asks her to the dance, but Elle is just very focused on helping them get Will back. So she opens up a portal to the Upside Down, which is the alternate dimension to where Will has disappeared to. And the monster, the Demogorgon, has Will and is ready to, you know, to eat him. Elle is able to open up that portal. Hopper and Joyce rescue Will, and Elle has a showdown with the monster, and it appears to, you know, turn into dust. And when we talk about season 2, we'll talk more about that. And Mike and his friends are glad to have Will back, but the fact that Elle had to be traded for him, you can tell that that's going to be something that is going to haunt Mike. Nancy finally realizes that her friend Barb is not coming back because Barb was killed. So there's, you know, a lot of emotion there. And you think that everything would be okay, but you can see that it's obviously not. And there's that scene at the end with the winter sky and all the stars, and you can tell that something's watching the town of Hawkins and Will and his friends in particular. Something is just looking out at them because they've opened up this portal to something that we're not supposed to know about, and we're better off not knowing about. It's very Lovecraftian. And then you have Will excusing himself from the Christmas dinner table, and he goes in the bathroom and he vomits up what looks to be a baby slug. And you can tell that it's an effect from him being in the Upside Down, because Will flashes back to being in the Upside Down. So you can tell that this is not over for him. It's not over by a long shot. And we didn't know if we were going to get a second season. So it was left pretty open, because you can see Hopper grabbing some snacks. And in particular, he's grabbing Eggo waffles. So that kind of hints that maybe Eleven didn't die after all. And like I said, more on that when we talk about the second season. But it tied things up, but it still left them open. I thought that was a smart way to play things. And, you know, it just left me wanting more. And I got more. I got season 2, which we'll talk about in another episode. And we have season 3, which is coming up sometime this summer. So, but anyway, guys, I gotta sign off for today. So, say goodbye to my little friend here, and I will see you guys later. May your days be long upon the earth.